Welcome to another episode of Teacher Talks with Michael Klotz, a series of conversations with some of my favorite string players about their beloved teachers. Today I am joined by violinist Gary Levinson in a conversation about his teacher, Dorothy DeLay. Good evening, Gary. Great to see you.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being a part of Teacher Talks. And today we're going to talk about one of your teachers, Dorothy DeLay. So could you tell us, how did you meet Miss DeLay?
Well, it was, as many things in life, it was a pure accident. My father, who's a pretty famous double bass player, who you know quite well because you've worked with him, was invited actually to substitute for someone who was unable to teach at the Aspen Music Festival, and I was at the time, I think, 12 years old. And, we were immigrants from the Soviet Union, and we came less than 2 years before. And basically, my parents' position was, well, this is a world-class music festival, so he should study with a world-class teacher. I'm sure there are lots of them. And we didn't really know that Miss DeLay was a legendary teacher, not a world-class teacher. And I think all that we knew at the time was that she had taught Itzhak Perlman, and that she was a very famous teacher. So the first time I played for her, it was quite strange in that she was more like a mom than a violin teacher. She called everyone Sugar Plum, and she just wanted to know what I did outside of violin playing. She wanted to see why I wanted to play Mendelssohn Concerto, even though I was learning the Mendelssohn Concerto. I mean, it was a very different experience, not what I was used to, but I loved it because I felt like every lesson with her was deeply personal. No cookie cutter or anything. Very quickly we learned that they were going to be late, and I mean days late. A 4 o'clock lesson never took place at 4, 5, or 6. But besides that, despite that, I learned so much even at the age of 12, where she made me think, where most 12-year-olds just react. And it was just one of those things where I remember to this day, the questions she asked are the questions I ask of myself, even as an adult, and I make my students do that. Because if you don't ask the questions, it's really hard to get to the depth of the music. If you just kind of go down the list and say, well, I'm doing this, I'm learning this, and then just play it, you're not going to reach your audience at a very deep level.
Could you go a little further with that? Talk about some of the questions that she would ask in lessons.
Well, so for example, I think one of the very first concertos I played for her was a Mendelssohn. And, it's an iconic piece. I mean, we all grew up with a Heifetz recording. And the Perlman recording, even at the time, was quite famous, and everyone knew it. I knew every single slide. I knew every single fingering. And so, I'm learning it. I've got the score, and this is hard for our listeners to imagine, unless they're of a certain age. But with no YouTube, the only thing you had was whatever recordings you brought with you to the Aspen Music Festival, plus the recordings from the library of the Aspen Music Festival. So if you really wanted to refer back to it, it was go to the library, whatever you had, on your Walkman, really dating myself now, and believe it or not, listening on the radio, because a lot of stuff on classical stations was the great concertos. So I would come in and play something for her, and then she would write very copious notes in the score. But she would say, well, I notice you're doing this. Why? Why are you making this shift here? Did you try it on a different string? Did you try taking more time here because you need more time there? And I would be, well, no. And the answer would be, well, why not? And I might say, well, because I can do it this way. And that was never good enough for her. Because you have to have a more musical or technical reason other than I can get away with it. She was actually very judicious, I would say, about making sure that when you were there in the lesson, you were engaged in what you were doing, not just replicating what you did in the practice room. And I always found that very exciting because, I was a real cowboy at the time. I was like, well, if you want me to do it this way, no problem. I'll just do it this way. I never practiced it. No problem. I can get it done. And sometimes it'd fall on my face and she would laugh. And sometimes it would work out. And she said, see, you need to try these things.
Wow, wonderful. I think everyone wants to know, what was her secret? I mean, you started to tell us about some of the questions that she would ask, but I mean, when you think about so many of the violinists that studied with her, that went on to such incredible careers as soloists and concertmasters and chamber players and professors, I mean, it's a veritable who's who. What was her secret? How did she have so many incredible people? Of course, she developed a reputation. That's part of it. But what can you talk a little bit more about that?
I would say it's hard to say that there is a secret or any one secret, for the simple reason that when you're a master teacher, as you are, you need to realize that one size never fits all. Interestingly enough, if you read about he did certainly have a certain scenario in which everyone went in, but I mean, that's 120, 30 years ago. I think her secret, if there was one, was that she had a degree in psychology, and she really connected with what made you tick, both positive and negative. And so in many ways, I'll never forget, there was a portion where I came to her and I was having real problem with the Sibelius Concerto some years later when I was already in Aspen, and it had to do with vibrato. And I was like, Miss DeLay, I can't make the double stops and the slow movement, the 3-against-2. And I was like, I can't vibrate this. I'm getting tense, and it just sounds stiff. And you know what she said to me? She said, well, are you playing the tune or are you playing the secondary line? And it completely floored me because I was so focused on doing the vibrato, making sure that everything was working over here. And she knew that. She didn't have to ask. And so I said, well, frankly, just trying to get through this thing, And she said, I think you should play the melody and let the big triplets just accompany, which relaxed the hand. And then all of a sudden it kind of worked, and I was actually listening more to the tone. I was listening more for the bow arm. Well, I was able to transfer that to the other things where I was having vibrato problems or shifting problems, because I was like, yeah, I mean, I can get to the vibrato if it's really not working, but maybe what I should really focus on is how can I make the music work, maybe non-vibrato. Stern had a great example of that. He said, if you didn't want to have the makeup, the maquillage, if you will, play everything non-vibrato and make it work. If you can have a beautiful tone with non-vibrato, the vibrato will help, certainly for romantic music. So she really knew what made people tick, and I think she actually studied all of us, whether it was, through notebooks or whatever. She did write a lot of stuff. We had practice manuals, left-hand technique, right-hand technique, for every single piece of music you brought in. So you might have 3 or 4 pages of goals and how you're doing at every one of them, which I loved because I could look back and see that, 2-3 weeks, this passage is not working. Whereas if it was not in front of you, I'd be like, well, I think it was pretty good last time. No. It was very clear on what she said was and was not working. And in some ways, at least in Aspen, I will tell you, I mean, it took such an effort to get a lesson. I mean, we were all into it. And I mean, I'm a night owl, as you know. I loved having my 11 o'clock lesson at night, midnight, no problem. And she'd go over, because she would be engaged. We were both awake, and then she'd drive me home, a gigantic car. I think she had like a 1976 Buick Regal, which was the size of a New York City block, and she drove way too fast, as I do, and, it would whip around the corner, and, it was so much fun to be with her when she was driving me home, and we would talk about music and what I just did, and, how stupid some of it was and how some of it was beautiful. So it was a really great symbiotic relationship.
Wow, that's amazing. Could you talk a little bit about some of her teachers? I know that she studied with Persinger, as did my teacher, Zvi Zeidlin, and Galamian. And can you talk about, did she draw from their influence, or was she really...
it's very interesting. She almost never mentioned her teachers. And she didn't demonstrate a lot, but when she did demonstrate, it was an absolute beauty of, her setup. I always remember that when she played, the bow arm she was just born to play the fiddle.
Mm-hmm.
And since she was a rather large lady, at least when I knew her, it was interesting how it was live playing. It was really, everything was quick and no points to it. It was just like you didn't know whether she practiced 5 hours a day or 5 hours a year, because everything just kind of worked.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, the only other one like that I know is David Nadian. I mean, it just, everything was working. But I will tell you that even though she didn't speak very much about her teachers and her influences, she spoke a lot about her star students, Itzhak being one, of course. Not just Helena Sonnenberg at the time when she won the Naumburg. I mean, she was there in Aspen riding her moped with us. And it was very interesting because, Nadja is a wild person, a real free spirit. But Miss DeLay always felt like, let me tell you about how serious she is about studying the score. Let me tell you how serious she is about playing chamber music. She's up at 11:30 studying the Storm Quintet, and you guys don't know that. So Miss DeLay oftentimes said that. I felt like she, in many ways, used the example of her most successful students to inspire the next generation of students, and that was one of her great geniuses.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, I mean, was really incredible for me when I was at Juilliard, and she passed away in my second year, like about a month and a half before I graduated or something. And I remember that day, it was in March, and there was like a cloud over the school. I mean, it was really, you really felt it, I mean, that such a icon had left us. And but I used to love seeing her around. In particular, used to love seeing her outside with Mr. Perlman, both on their respective electric scooters and kind of holding a summit. and really, I mean, growing up on Perlman and Zuckerman and people like that, it was incredible. Even I was starstruck every time I would see like the two of them together, or even every time I would see her. I mean, I saw her at the school. It was just kind of like, wow, there's Dorothy DeLay, the teacher of everybody. So she had that, certainly had that appeal. I wanted to know, she was quite busy. So let's get a little controversial here, if we can. People say, oh, Miss DeLay, I mean, of course, she's a wonderful teacher, but, she had 100 students, between, she taught at Juilliard and she taught at Cincinnati for 30 years.
Yeah.
And Sarah Lawrence College, I believe she had a position there, NEC briefly, probably people coming from all over the world to play for her. But how the heck did she do it?
Well,
And did you have lessons all the time?
Right. So let me start by saying that I had a colleague whose name should remain nameless.
Yeah.
Who actually calculated that she owed him something like 487 hours of lessons.
Oh my gosh.
He got a doctorate.
Okay.
Enough said. But I got lessons all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure it had to do with the quality of my playing, and my commitment to the music was not unusual. I think most of the people in my class were totally committed to it. I don't know anybody in her class who was just kind of riding it out. I think Peskanov told me this, and other people. We got lessons because we kept her interested. Mm-hmm. And I understand that that's maybe something that's strange these days. Let me just say that the converse was not necessarily true. If you didn't keep her interested, it didn't mean that she would just tune out and not teach you. Mm-hmm. But when she was interested, you could see the intensity in her eyes, and she would get into the lesson more. And she would start tapping her foot. She'd get excited, and you could see that excitement in her body language. And you could see her, she would start speaking faster, and she would write faster, and the smile would grow bigger and bigger if you were doing it right. And I think, as I said before, the symbiotic relationship between exciting her was exciting to me, and I could feel like my playing was better, even though I'm not sure this is the way it's really going to work. And she would say, well, Pinky would do this on stage, and even if it didn't work, he would do it again until it did work. Or Shlomo would do it this way, and, they were not afraid to fail. So I was thinking that, well, I am afraid to fail, but maybe I should try it in a more controlled atmosphere so I don't fail all the time. And she was very encouraging about that. She would be very encouraging when Gil Shaham, as a young kid, would come in and say, well, it's not working, Miss DeLay. And she said, well, then try it again. Try something else. Let's work this out. She was not afraid for the student to talk with her. The dialogue, it wasn't so much about pleasing the student, but accomplishing the goal. And she was dogged at accomplishing the goal. If you were to play the last rose and it wasn't clean, she would just say, come back and play it better. Mm-hmm. And if it was not working, let's figure out what's not working. Isolate what is not working. Make it work. If you don't like this fingering, I'll give you 17 others that work. Mm-hmm. And you try each one of them until it works for you. But at no point it was like, well, if this is too hard for you, dear, you're a sugar plum. Let's just play Vivaldi A minor. She would not. I would say the better the student, the more dogged she was about accomplishing and really fulfilling your potential. I don't remember her ever saying, well, you can't do it, so, well, it's all right. Go play baseball. She was actually very dogged about it.
Who were some of the violinists that she, other than her own students, but whom did she admire of the greats?
Well, I think everyone admired Heifetz. She loved Oistrak's bow arm, which was very dear to my heart because he was the reason I became a violinist. I certainly think that in New York, you still had the Juilliard Quartet on her faculty, the Guarneri Quartet, Yo-Yo. The people that are legends now generally were legends then. I'm not that old, And the beauty of living in New York at the time is that, no matter where you lived in Manhattan, as you know, you could go to 7 concerts a night if you wanted to, and we went to many. That's maybe one of the things that I miss in today's generation is that, because of the convenience of YouTube, people kind of feel like, well, I don't have to go to live performance because I can just watch it on YouTube. I can watch it on Medici. Yeah. Ain't the same thing.
No.
Anyone who's a sports fan will tell you, it's not the same as watching it on TV. You watch a football game or you're in row, in section 302. It's not the same. It's never going to be the same. It's not meant to be the same. And she knew that. She made us go to concerts. She actually made us write reviews so that we got something from the concert rather than say, well, it was really pretty. Or, the guy played out of tune. What's next? No. You had to actually come up with we did something that I really loved, and I try to do that with my students. And we did a studio class. She had at least once a week where all the students would show up in her studio, and the studio is giant. So we'd all sit on the floor, and then as we went around the room, the only rule was your commentary has to be conducive to the success of the student. In other words, you couldn't say, well, I can't believe you played it like that. You had to come in and say, well, I wasn't really convinced of your exposition, and I would love to see you try blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. It had to be some kind of constructive criticism, but not just criticism. It had to be a constructive thought. And I think that was one of the things that I remember from her in my own, like I'd go back to the practice room and instead of just trying it again, I was like, what if I was playing and I was also the student? What would I say to myself if I heard it this way? Mm-hmm. And I found that my practicing got much more efficient. Mm-hmm. Certainly in my second year at Juilliard. Because that first year, waiting for the lessons, I probably did 6 hours, every day, just waiting for the lesson, which is great, because there was a lot of playing, but not a lot of learning. It was just really staying hot all the time and sounding great outside. But in the second year, I was like, well, if I'm going to, spend the 6 hours, maybe I should actually learn something. It wouldn't hurt, other than playing for my friends and hanging out with them, So she taught us how to be more efficient, I think, and that's something we can take away for our whole lives.
That's really amazing. And her dedication was unlike anyone else. I'll leave some details out, but I remember once I was with a few friends, and we had gone to some of the finer establishments in New York on a Saturday night, and we came back. I lived in the dorm my first year at Juilliard, we must have come back around 2 o'clock in the morning, and we saw her coming out of the school.
Right.
And I was with one of her students, and she said, I'll keep him nameless. And what are you doing? And he was clearly, not practicing the violin. He said, oh, just hanging out with some friends. And he says, what are you doing? She said, well, what do you think I was doing? I just finished a lesson.
Yeah, exactly.
Like at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday night.
I'm telling you, there's nothing wrong. I'm sure I had many lessons that ended at 2 o'clock in the morning or later. And then, we probably walked home because it was so much fun to think back about the things we did in that lesson. Yeah. Because as I said before, the clock was very uninfluential. The lesson could have been an hour and a half or 2 hours or 45 minutes. It was just kind of like, when the lesson was over, it was over. And when she had something to say and it went on, it just went on. And I think in many ways I was a beneficiary of that, because as long as I kept her interested and I had stuff to ask, and I did have stuff to ask her, we went on and on. It was fun.
Talk a little bit, Gary, if you don't mind, about the career aspect. I mean, obviously, she was a great teacher, but, to have so many students go on to such successful careers, I mean, she certainly wielded quite a bit of influence in the music world. So I guess the question I have is, was it just kind of based on who she liked, or did she go to bat for all of her students in one way or another? Could you talk about that, her support of her students?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I would say she did go to bat for any student she had, but, well, let me put it this way. When she came to fore in the late 40s and 50s, a violin teacher who was a woman was pretty unusual at that level. Mm-hmm. And I think she took that pride with her when she became close friends with Lee Lamont and Cami, and of course Stern. And she strategically understood the path from conservatory / university to the major stage. I remember she spoke oftentimes about the competition route, which these days is very common. And then she talked about all the people who never played competitions and how they made it. Mm-hmm. So again, the psychology part of her teaching was front and center. I think in many ways she understood that whatever the kid needed, if she could connect a certain impresario or a certain concert with the way that kid played, it was going to benefit the kid. I was shocked to tears that she came to my debut recital at Merkin Hall, and I was sure she was never going to come because it was like at 7:30 on a Wednesday. As we all know, she had scheduled some lessons and probably had at least 30 that were carried over from previous days or weeks. And there she was, and she sat with our friends. She sat through the whole thing. She came backstage. She gave me a big hug. She was like, you've got the nerve for major international competitions. It was that simple. And so I went out and played them. So I really think that it depended very much on each student and, what your musical DNA was. Mm-hmm. That's the way I would put it. Some people needed more support. Other people needed to be challenged. Other people needed to be sent over to this, which was strategically going to get you to here, and so on and so forth. She basically was the godmother. She had it all in her head. Didn't need to figure out who needed what. She looked at you. She knew you, and also she knew me very well from Aspen. I mean, by the time I got to Juilliard, I'd already been in Aspen, I think 7 summers. Mm-hmm. So she knew exactly what I was good at and what my musical profile was going to be.
You won a position in the New York Philharmonic when you were 21, and you were at the time studying with her.
Yeah.
So tell us about that. How did she feel about you accepting that job, and talk to us about that?
Well, so
to get you in trouble here. No.
No, it's okay. It was actually very funny. I played the audition for a very simple reason. I wanted to get my master's, and it was unaffordable. So I realized over the course of my undergrad that the amount of money it took for me to do gigs so I could pay the rent was taken away from my practice time and from my performance time.
Mm-hmm.
So it occurred to me, with no experience, even though I played in the Juilliard Orchestra, that if I could just make the finals in the New York Philharmonic, to get on the sub list, would save me time, first of all, because the gig, quote unquote, was across the street. So I could just go over there and come right back. And then the amount of money you're making at scale of the New York Philharmonic, was going to pay the rent, and I could spend the rest of my time practicing and playing concerts that I wanted to. Well, after I got the job, completely to my surprise, flabbergasted, the first person was most flabbergasted was my father. I'm like, what? You can't be doing this. Well,
he was the principal. He was the principal at the time.
The New York Phil,
right.
But his position was like mine. It's like, there's no way this guy's going to get the job, make the finals, get on the sub list, play your concerts, and then we'll see what happens. Well, so when Zubin Mehta offered me the job, and we were shocked and thrilled, I went to her and I said to her, Miss DeLay, I won this job. It's really cool. And she said, congratulations, don't take it. And I said to her, don't take it? She said, it's not going to be good for you. And that was like 2 years before Carrie McDermott, who was a finalist in the Tchaikovsky competition, she got a diploma, studied at Manhattan School, was already in the orchestra. But, she was a budding soloist. And Miss DeLay knew her playing very well because of all the McDermott sisters, also because of Anne-Marie, And she said, I don't think that you're going to be able to do what you really want to do if you're playing in the orchestra. And I said to her what Zubin Mehta said to me. And when he congratulated me after I won the job, he said, look, I know, and he didn't know me from before, but he could hear in the audition. He says, I know what you're like as a violinist. And he said, I will never block your career if you want to play solos, if you want to play international competitions, if you want to take a week off and do a tour on your own, I will support that. So I relayed that to Miss DeLay, and she said, well, that is unusual, but I still don't think you should take it. And I said to her, look, I respect you and I love you so much, but I can't not take it because the people I was going to be learning from in the New York Philharmonic,
sure,
I couldn't give up that opportunity. And I think it was the right move, although I know she was unhappy with me for that. She didn't like to be not listened to. She was used to people listening to her.
How did she feel in general about her students taking orchestral positions? I mean, of course, it was a little bit different then.
Very different.
Yeah. Extremely
different. Why was it different? Today, there's almost no teacher that doesn't teach excerpts.
Yeah, it's true.
Miss DeLay nobody would ask for excerpts.
Yeah.
Nobody would ask her to listen to excerpts. And by the way, not because she couldn't do it, but that was kind of not what she did. Mm-hmm. I think in many ways, the orchestra was a different way of doing things. Mm-hmm. It's funny because I think if somebody came to Miss DeLay and said, look, I want to join a string quartet, she probably would have a similar reaction.
Mm-hmm.
She felt like if you could be a soloist, you should be a soloist.
Right.
And, if you want to go do other things, like Nadine, who we alluded to before, fine, do them. But don't forget, you're really a soloist.
Yeah.
And I think for all of us, I'd won a couple of international competitions. I was going on tour, and I knew what it was like to be 19 years old and be on the road for 2.5 weeks, playing every night. It's oftentimes different programs. It was frankly exhausting. It was exhilarating, mm-hmm. but very exhausting.
Yeah.
And there was a portion of me, a small portion, but a portion nonetheless, I said, I don't know if I can sustain this for 35 years, even if it's offered to me. Mm-hmm. I'd love the opportunity, but I wasn't sure that, I could do it at that level. And I didn't want to, certainly did not want to disappoint her. I never wanted her to come to a concert of mine and have less of a reaction than at my debut recital, where it really went well.
Well, when you think about so many great soloists, spent significant time in orchestra. I think about, Joey Silverstein, of course, the legendary Boston concertmaster, and Shumsky, and Shumsky was someone who, like Nadian, did many, many different things. And, and then, of course, even your teacher after Miss DeLay, you studied, of course, with Glenn Dicterow. And he was absolutely trained to be a soloist, right? And won a prize in the Tchaikovsky and all that.
Absolutely. Also, yeah, I mean, like Mr. Gingold as a concertmaster of the Cleveland Orchestra. Yeah. There were so many great soloists. Heinz Taub from the Israel Philharmonic. There were so many great people who were concertmasters and principal cellists, as we know, Harvey Shapiro, the legendary Harvey. I don't want our listeners to think that at the time we looked down upon playing in the orchestra, which is not true.
Right.
I think that in many ways, Miss DeLay, Galimir, their métier, if you will, was to produce people who are capable of being soloists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think in their mind is, if you want to do something else, you want to become a bricklayer, no problem. But my job is to get you to become a soloist, and then after that, you do what you want. So, I will say that she was great with me when I was in the orchestra, when I would see her, and she paid me probably the highest compliment. She says, when I listen to you in the orchestra, you play like you always have. You're not phoning it in. That's great. I was like, well, Miss DeLay, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to phone it in. It's just not my personality, which you know. And she said, I know, but I'm glad you're still the same guy who came to me at 12.
Well, that's wonderful. And of course, yeah, I mean, we always joke every time I'm with you in Dallas. I don't know anyone busier than you, Gary. Well, pre-pandemic, of course, but between you're of course the Senior Principal Associate Concertmaster of Dallas Symphony, and you often lead the orchestra, and you're the Artistic Director of the Chamber Music Society of Fort Worth, which I'm very privileged to be a part of, and you're a big help with your wife's series, Blue Candlelight, and in addition, festivals. You're busy, man. I mean, you're always busy.
I will say that's not a Miss DeLay conversation. That was actually from Mr. Dicterow and from my colleagues in New York Philharmonic. One of the very first people I played with, who was not a violinist, was Stanley Drucker, the legendary principal clarinet of the Philharmonic. The guy never stopped. I mean, as you know, even when he retired after 54 years of service in the New York Phil, he was playing all the time. One of the first people who retired in the New York Philharmonic, Leonard Davis, legendary violist, associate principal. Mm-hmm. The first thing he said to me when I saw him on the street after his retirement, he says, got 50 concerts scheduled and 17 solo recitals. So for him, retirement was liberation. He could do whatever he wanted to. So my feeling always was, you don't identify yourself with any one thing. You try to be good at various aspects of fiddle playing, because you want to be a complete violinist. You don't want to be it's funny, in the age of specialization, I think the people who are new music specialists, Baroque specialists, Uppo specialists, I don't know. I'd rather be a special player rather than a specialist. Mm-hmm. It'd be good. The compliment that I always speaks to my heart is, hey, I can tell it's you from one note. Yeah. That's the one.
That's wonderful. Wow. Well, I think we're getting close to the grand finish line. Is there anything you'd like to add about Miss DeLay?
Well, I just would say that her legend is so deserved. She really had an incredible, indelible stamp on American violin playing. And I do emphasize American, not because she didn't have international students, of course she did, but the approach, the psychology we spoke about, the fiddle playing, the approach of the Galimir school, coupled with what I would say is modern solo and chamber music orchestra technique, really made for a different echelon of fiddle players. Mm-hmm. And if we have any success, it is in great part due to her.
Absolutely. Well, I wish I had gotten to study with her, but
you had good teachers.
I did have some good teachers. But anyway, wonderful, Gary. Thank you so much as always, and
such a pleasure.
We'll talk soon.